I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down.
I'm going to vote for Barry Goldwater, and I urge you to do the same.
1965.
United States aircraft have resumed action in North Vietnam.
Demonstrators must depart from the Pentagon grounds by midnight.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot outside a Memphis motel this afternoon.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible?
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
You got to put his challenge to go to the moon in a proper context of time. The Russians owned space at that point in time. Sputnik had long since been launched. Yuri Gagarin went up the previous month, the first human being ever to get into space, and he orbited the Earth once, came back. And Alan Shepard finally went up 16 minutes and came down. He didn't even get in orbit. This country was decimated with campus unrest, civil strife, the beginnings of what became a very, very unpopular war. We desperately needed a hero. And Alan Shepard, back in May of 1961, was our hero. 3 weeks later, the President of the United States says, okay, now we're going to go to the moon. I guess we know enough about space. We didn't know tiddlywinks about going into space. And he not only challenged us to go to the moon, he challenged us to do what most people thought was impossible. He challenged us to get to the moon before the end of the decade. And what he didn't say, but what he really meant was we're going to get there before the other guy does, before the Soviets did at that point in time. And that challenge, the gauntlet was picked up by the American people. All of a sudden people got involved, and they didn't know they couldn't do it.
Look, another one of those spaceships.
Buck Rogers.
No such thing as space travel.
No such word as astronaut.
Couldn't even spell astronaut, probably. I don't even remember anybody dreaming of that.
In those days, you read Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers.
Buck Rogers going through the universe on a rocket ship somewhere. That was truly fantasy.
This ship's at least 100 years ahead of anything I ever saw. I wonder how fast we're going. About 1,000 miles an hour at least.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Born from a generation nurtured by space heroes, these men turned science fiction fantasy into reality. It became man's supreme effort. 12 extraordinary men were the first humans to walk on another world, spearheading the greatest adventure in history. They gave us all hope at a time when the heart of our nation was in anguish and turmoil. They made the world pause. Have you ever walked on a cloudless night with a view of the heavens and wondered what it must have been like to walk on that airless moon? What kind of person would be willing to risk their life to leave Mother Earth? Why was anyone willing to leave our world for the first time in history? Have you ever wondered who these men are and what they accomplished? These are the men who allowed themselves to be lifted off the earth by the inspired work of 450,000 people. And yet these chosen few, each hurtling into history, we hardly know.
As a kid, I wanted to be an airplane pilot, and I saw the movies, and I saw Earl Flynn or John Wayne or somebody like that flying airplanes, and I thought, boy, this looks like a lot of fun. Never thought of going into space, never imagined that that would happen.
I became a pilot when I was 13. I washed airplanes to earn flying time when I was still a teenager. But I also was interested in engineering and science.
So it sort of narrowed down eventually that I would want to go to one of the academies, and my father preferred the Naval Academy, but I decided, since I had gotten seasick as a youngster at summer camp, that maybe going to West Point would be a better thing to do.
And I knew very early in my life I wanted to fly. I wanted to fly airplanes. I wanted to go one step further. I wanted to fly airplanes off of aircraft carriers, because I guess that even challenged me more as a third or fourth or fifth grader.
I was going to be an aeronautical engineer and build airplanes, and I built them all the way through high school.
Well, the first thing I can remember as an aspiration was to be a forest ranger. I thought for some reason it would be neat to be out in a lookout tower looking for forest fires. That's the first sort of career idea that I can remember having. I don't know how old I was.
I fell in love with airplanes while I was at the Naval Academy. I had this young desire, but then I sort of transferred it to the Navy, but then I realized at the Naval Academy I could go fly airplanes. And so I made the decision my senior year to go volunteer for the Air Force.
All of us came to NASA because we were good at flying high-performance airplanes. We were good at doing the things in the best airplanes that there were, okay? And suddenly the space program shows up, so now we get a chance to do those things in a spaceship, which is even more complicated and even more difficult, even more dangerous. So that appealed to all of us.
And it wasn't until I'd been in the service as a naval officer and pilot, about to complete my service, when Sputnik went up. I was quite sure that humans would be right behind robot spacecraft. So going into space suddenly became the objective. But that wasn't until 1957.
Well, when President Kennedy said he wanted to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth within a decade, and I was a test pilot at Patuxent River, and returning safely to Earth sounded like a great idea to me. So I told all my buddies they ought to put in for it. They were looking for test pilots, and so we all put in for it.
But I never really started to think about space until I was in Norway as a Fulbright student in 1957, and experienced, like so many people of my generation, the launching of the first artificial satellite of the Earth, Sputnik 1, and saw its impact on the international student community that was there with me at the time. And so that sort of triggered at least me thinking about space as something important that was going on.
So I was off being a test pilot. I was accepted and went through test pilot school and was doing that, and just thought I had the greatest job in the world. And one day I turned on the TV and there was Al Shepard on top of a rocket, and he went off, and just in 15 minutes he'd gone higher than I'd ever gone and faster than I'd ever gone, and more importantly, made more noise doing it. I said, you know, maybe he's got the best job in the world.
And so I volunteered for test pilot school, where I could use my education and satisfy my love for flying. I think it was September of 1965, NASA announced that they were going to have another group of astronauts that would be picked and hopefully trained for this Apollo program. And so I volunteered because it was the best job you could have as a test pilot back in those days.
I just happened to be in the pipeline where astronauts came from, because we needed people to fly spaceships, and the closest thing to flying spaceships on Earth is flying high-performance airplanes. And so I began to see how to become an astronaut, and it turns out that I was accidentally in the pipeline. So I applied to be an astronaut, and with my background and through the selection programs, they took me.
Well, when NASA and the National Academy of Sciences decided jointly that they would ask for volunteers from the science and engineering community to become astronauts. I thought about 10 seconds and said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
I was assigned over to Korea flying F-86s. I did have two opportunities to shoot down two MiG-15s, which I did during the 66 combat missions that I flew. With about 8 years service as a fighter pilot, I decided I'd go to MIT for a master's program. I'd chosen my thesis subject, which was rendezvous in space. I understood how to intercept airplanes in the atmosphere, but everyone was going to have to be able to join up spacecraft, so it was perhaps one of the wisest decisions I made in 1961, really, before it was even decided for sure that lunar orbit rendezvous would be the method of our getting to the moon.
I was chosen because I had impeccable credentials, a good record. I was the only astronaut at that point in history that had both test pilot credentials and a PhD from an engineering school. So I had been adding credentials until they couldn't ignore me any longer.
So in October of 1963, I got a phone call from Deke Slayton asking me if I wanted to join the astronaut program. And of course I said I would, and we started training in January of 1964.
The selection process is still a big mystery to me. We didn't have a big chart with fill these X's and do these squares and check off these procedures and you're going to get a flight.
Don't have a clue. There were some really good people that didn't get selected, and I was just lucky to be one of the people that did. And I feel lucky enough to have been at the right place at the right time and doing the kind of things that I'm able to do. I'm able to learn systems and how they operate and how they don't operate, and participate in spacecraft test and development and check out for human beings.
But there was no guarantee you were going to fly in Apollo, but you would be working on Apollo. So that's where everybody's focus was. We had engineering duties, if you will, sort of oversight of certain systems of the spacecraft and the launch vehicle. I was assigned to work for Frank Borman on the Saturn V launch vehicle.
And then they suddenly decided to put me over in Skylab. And Skylab was the next program after Apollo. Well, I didn't want to be there. Nobody wanted to be there. But there I was, and once again I had the choice. Am I going to go pout because I'm not in Apollo where I really want to be and my friends are, or am I going to try to do Skylab as good as I can do? Well, I decided to do Skylab as good as I could do. So I was just minding my own business. And one day, Pete Conrad came wandering by and he says, "Let me talk with you a minute." I said, "Okay." I had no idea what he was talking. I had no thought, really. Well, I wonder why he's talking to me. Because we weren't working on the same program, you know, he's a friend. And so he asked me if I'd like to be part of their crew. Well, I couldn't even, not only couldn't believe it, it just didn't seem real. You know, it wasn't something I was thinking about. And of course, when it took me 2 or 3 minutes to kind of sink in that maybe I was, in fact, going to be part of Apollo, well, of course, I said yes. And so that's how I got on the crew. It was really great. I think of Pete all the time and how he wanted to help me become a better human being and astronaut.
How I came to be one of those people to have had that opportunity is something I'll never be able to explain.
When I received the call from Deke Slayton that his original recommendation that Joe Engle fly on Apollo 17 had been overturned by headquarters, and headquarters had asked him to find some way to put me on a crew, and he basically just decided that I would substitute on the crew that was training for Apollo 17. So I was very excited about the whole thing, but tried not to show it too much.
Our command module pilot, Stuart Rusa, he had always had the remark when we started to ignite engines, well, gentlemen, it's sweaty palms time again. And yes, there's always a heightened sense of alertness, of apprehension when you ignited engines, because likely if something was going to happen, that's when it was going to happen.
Did we want to be heroes? Did we want to be presented as fearless, grim-jawed, steely-eyed? No, I don't think so.
We all knew the risk. What was happening here is we were developing a whole new technology. And we were trying to develop the procedures and the hardware, all that sort of thing, by the end of the decade. And we knew that any time you did new things, then you made mistakes. Don't forget, hardware and software are made by humans. They're extensions of us. We know humans are not perfect. So we all know that what we're doing isn't perfect. But we're trying to invent a system of checks and balances where we invent it and somebody checks it and somebody tests it. We try to invent something so we don't have any problems. But we know we're also on a time schedule, so we know we're just doing the best we can in this much time. But you see, the flight after us was Apollo 13. The problems, the human errors that we all have, we all do, caught up with them.
No, I don't think you'd say we're fearless. I'm answering that question about fear then from where I am sitting now, and there's a realization that maybe I was pretty naive then not to be aware, but maybe it was a good thing. I was aware enough to be alert to what might go wrong, but not in any way to have it hamper my actions.
No, not fearless. I just practice a lot, so I'm able to concentrate. I think it's really worth it to take those kind of risks. Chances of going to the moon and back, they told me, my wife Susie worked for the people who did a probability risk assessment, and she told me the risk on Apollo 16 of getting back okay was 1 in 5. She said I blew it off, and I don't remember her telling me anything like that. But, it's a risk worth taking.
The probability of success in Apollo was really quite high, and I can't ever remember, oh, woe is me, why am I doing this, that kind of attitude. If that attitude had been prevalent within, you wouldn't have done it. You wouldn't have volunteered for the space program. We wanted to go, and we were really for the thrill of adventure and the desire to explore. And it was the ultimate job as a test pilot, and you just wanted to fly it.
And you don't want a chain of events to start. And as long as they don't start, you're in great shape. But I think all of that is superseded by the realization that guys who have been in hazardous conditions in jet airplanes know that things can get out of hand in a hurry, and it requires you to take some action, and it is a dangerous and a lethal business if you don't make the right decisions or you can't counteract the emergency that comes up.
If you're well trained, you can start to put any fear that you might have into the background. And in fact, I think that anybody who ended up actually being selected as an astronaut had gone through that process long, long before, or you would never have volunteered. We trained for the better part of 18 months to be sure that we were successful. And you've got to stay with that discipline all the way through the process.
And if you're going to handle your fear, you have to learn to manage it as a feeling. And so one way to do that is you shut it off. You shut off feelings. Being pilots, being warriors, as it were, and in this case, being explorers to go to another world, we knew there was risk.
They had 8 astronauts killed in those days. We had 4 airplane accidents, 3 killed in a fire at Kennedy Space Center in a spacecraft, 1 automobile accident.
We lost 3 guys in the Apollo 1 fire way back before we ever got an Apollo spaceship off the ground. And I remember being in Arlington that day, burying a couple of my colleagues back in '67, a cold February day. And I wasn't sure whether we were burying the entire Apollo program at that moment in time, or whether we were just simply burying a couple of our friends. It's a cliche to say they didn't die in vain, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, but they truly didn't. If it weren't for their sacrifice and the mistakes we made early on in Apollo to get to the moon as quickly as we could, we probably would have lost somebody on the way. But they stimulated the redesign of this spacecraft to allow us to get there safely and return home and get the job done. You know, and those three guys have never received the tribute that I think they deserve.
In some way, there was probably a mentality, well, it's not going to happen to me, and if I do get in a tight situation, you know, I'm trained, well trained, and I'm going to make it. I'm going to overcome it. And we, in the back of our minds, we knew there were some situations where that wasn't true.
Well, anything that's worthwhile is going to have risk involved, and I think everybody should realize that. But with Apollo 1 fire, for example, yes, we built unnecessary risks into that program, but we learned from that, from Apollo 1. We learned the mistakes that we had made, and we worked through those and had a much stronger program after Apollo 1 than we would have had there been no fire.
And then Apollo 13 came along, and I'm not sure people fully appreciated then, or even today, how close we came to losing 3 human beings to the endlessness of time and space. You know, failure is not an option, and that's it's a nice word, nice cliche, nice phrase. But I want to tell you, at that point in time, it may not have been an option, but failure was sure a possibility. The greatest tribute to the human endeavor of Apollo was Apollo 13, even maybe more so than Apollo 11.
Oh, I think we were all aware of how historic this whole effort was.
I never heard astronauts walking around saying, boy, we're going to make history. I can't wait to get on the moon and do geology or any of that stuff. Everybody was thinking about how do you do the entry? How do you fly it? How do you minimize the fuel? Because that's the kind of people we were. So even though we were aware that this was a historic event, that isn't what we cared about all the time.
I think we did have a sense of history. Certainly working on Apollo 11 gave me a real feeling that I had contributed to something that was one of the most historical events of humankind, at least from the aviation standpoint.
What the historians were writing, what the newspapers were writing, what people were saying, you said, oh, yeah, but this is history. Some senior person in government asked me, did I read history? And I said, yes, but at the moment I'm too busy making it to read much about it.
Well, going to the moon certainly altered my place in history. I knew it was going to be significant, and as the crew options became available and it settled down that Neil and I ended up on the backup crew for Apollo 8. So after Apollo 8 flew, there was a couple of weeks, and then it came out, the announcement that Neil, Mike Collins, and I would be on the crew for Apollo 11. And we would be given the mission of landing if the next 2 missions were successful. That was a pretty big if, but it still made our mission announced in January as the potential first lunar landing.
I certainly wasn't aware of any historical significance. I thought we'd go to the moon and put up a base and stay there. We should have done that. If we had, the world would be infinitely better off than they are today, but we didn't.
When JFK challenged American people, whether he was a dreamer, whether he was a visionary or politically astute, and he was probably all three, but we also will never know whether he fully understood the challenge that he laid down in front of the American people.
Because of the significance of our mission, we felt we didn't want to be distracted by concentrating even a little bit of our attention on something that was separate from contributing to the success of the mission, which was landing on the moon. So we had an awful lot of time of just kind of looking out the window, mentally wondering what we ought to be thinking about. We were not particularly a exuberant, extrovert crew, there was not a lot of idle conversation. It was usually centered around something we were doing or responding to communication back with the Earth. As judged by other observers, there was probably an inordinate amount of quiet time on board the spacecraft.
What you start to experience is, of course, as all astronauts have, is you start to see the Earth without boundaries. You start to realize what we humans do to each other down here with our continual bickering and fighting and our assault on the environment and destroying the very infrastructure that keeps this place whole and permits life.
And I can remember looking up and seeing the moon and seeing so many more craters than in the simulator. I mean, naturally, we just had a few in there, maybe several hundred. Well, there were thousands out there. And I thought to myself, I hope Pete lands straight ahead, because if he lands over there or there, we could tip over. So it was kind of a crazy thought, but there it was. Also, I noticed that when I looked out the window, that I was kind of get excited and scared.
Hey, there it is. There it is. Son of a gun, right down the middle of the road. Outstanding, 42 degrees, Pete. Hey, it's starting right in the center of the crater. Look out there. I can't believe it. Amazing. Fantastic.
So I would look in, and so my peripheral vision wouldn't look out and see this. And I would look at the computer and some of these other controls, and it would look just like the simulator back on Earth. And so I would calm down by doing that. But I didn't want to miss the trip either, so then I would look out, and I would get excited after looking a while and then do it. So I did that 2 or 3 times.
When Mattingly reported there was something wrong with the service module engine,
Lunar Module Orion has been advised of the possibility of a wave-off for landing on this revolution. It seems that the circularization burn on the command module Casper was unsuccessful.
if your heart could sink to the bottom of your boots in zero gravity, ours sank to the bottom of our boots because it was an abort. I mean, we knew this is real serious. That's your ride home. And so we got very quiet and, you know, had a few choice words. And so for the next several hours, we were trying to get ourselves mentally in the attitude, are we going to join up and come home? Which was a bitter pill to swallow because you trained for 2 years, you'd come 240,000 miles, you were orbiting the moon 1 hour before you were landing. You could look down and there was your landing site 8 miles beneath you, and they're about to say, come home. So, in fact, they said, you guys get mentally prepared and, you know, we're going to see what we're going to do.
After having attended a meeting by management people in one of the back rooms, the situation is go for landing.
So they said, okay, you go for landing, and man, we just, I mean, our our spirits lifted by, 10,000%.
And you get close to the ground, and you know you're committed. You have no way out. You either land or you crash because you're not going to get out of there. And you got the dust blowing and the vibration and the noise. It's a very dynamic moment. The ground's talking to you. Your partner's giving you information. And lots of things are happening. You get close to the surface, and you shut that engine down. The noise stops. The vibration stops. The dust is instantly gone. And you're looking out that window, and you realize you are now seeing what has never been seen by a human being.
When we landed on the moon and stopped and turned off the engine, I thought, wow, we've got to get this thing going again. We've got to get going 6,000 miles an hour again to get Dick Gordon up in the command module, and then we've got to come out of lunar orbit, burn our engine to go back home. And then I thought, well, I knew that, but the strange thing was I hadn't thought about it like if I were driving across the Sahara Desert by myself in a car with two other people, and halfway in the middle of the desert, stop the car, turn off the engine and all that other, spend a couple of days, and then get back in and have to start it up again. Because we all know that the problems seem to happen in cars or airplanes when you get ready to start them. I mean, they're running great. And I thought, we've got to get going fast again.
If we're surprised by anything, it was that nothing really came along to surprise us. I guess there was a reality of being there for the first time, and that's got to have surprise as an ingredient to it, because you can't anticipate. You just, at least I couldn't in any way have projected ahead the scenes that I began to see.
The initial impulse upon stepping on the moon is wow. We're an explorer, being where humans have never been before. What more can an explorer ask? But then you get back to reality very quickly because the clock is ticking. The checklist says do this, do that, and do this. So you get to work. There's very little time for introspection.
When I was there and actually getting out of the spacecraft, going down the ladder, I was focused on what needed to be done. I mean, we're talking about, in those year dollars, something like $1 million a man-minute on the moon, and just that pure economic incentive was significant. But more importantly, I wanted to get as much done while I was there as I possibly could, and having as much fun doing it as I possibly could.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December, May.
And I didn't have any hesitancy of jumping off the footpad onto the moon because I knew I wasn't going to sink out of sight into dust, and so it was almost a feeling of euphoria. Yahoo! Here we are, Houston. We're ready to go. And I just remember hitting the ground running.
Fantastic! Percy Precision is Planet One on the plains of Descartes.
I think the overall emotion I had was just one of intense excitement and wonder that, awe. Yeah, man, I'm on the moon.
My thought was, I've got to look at my cuff checklist, which has what we're supposed to do next, and it has a timeline with it. So I was trying to get my balance and trying to get on that timeline so I didn't fall behind. So I had no thoughts of history or anything like that. It was all getting the job done.
We were all overbooked by about 20 to 40% of the timeline, and I was thinking we were 20 minutes behind and we got to catch up. We didn't let us walk, we had to run. We worked on the moon. We were thinking about getting the timeline done and getting the work done, and then visiting all the sites and picking up all the rock samples and doing the right thing. And I wouldn't have given us any moments either if I'd have made out the timeline.
We definitely and deliberately planned the lunar surface activities to be about 120% of human capability, for the simple reason something might fail and we wouldn't have to do that task or couldn't do that task. Since nothing failed, we had to work at 120% of human capability all the time. And that left very little time to be a tourist, to be introspective, to look around and enjoy the scenery.
Well, of course, anytime you have an opportunity to change from teacher to pupil, it can be very exciting. And of course, I became a pupil. As soon as I stepped out of the lunar module, I was learning once again about a brand new environment, a place where nobody had ever been before.
Here I am, folks, in the middle of the boulder field, just minding my own business.
And what you wanted to do as a pupil is cram your mind full of as much information as you possibly could, realizing that with your memories as well as the notes you were taking by verbally describing what you were seeing.
I know that I mentioned it, the texture, mineral texture appears to be subophilic to sort of like a good diabase, although a little coarser.
You're going to have time later on to try to pull this all together and synthesize it.
That this was something that was real, and yet it lacked a good bit of reality. It was somewhat of a dreamlike. It was like being in an alien world, but that tends to mislead people if you use that term. But it had a serenity to it, a quietness. Intellectually, we knew where we were, what we were doing, but the visual, I think, is what engulfed most of the stimulation toward what reaction or what feelings we'd have.
We had mountains rising above us on three sides that are higher than the Grand Canyon is deep, and we landed down in the middle of that. No trees, no, it's not green, no water, no Colorado River running through, nothing. How can something so desolate be so magnificent? It's the moment of it all, I guess.
To tell you the truth, the front side of the moon looks pretty innocuous in terms of holes. The back side of the moon is full of holes of Swiss cheese.
You feel much further from Earth than I thought I would, or I felt much further from Earth. I can remember looking up at the moon, at the Earth, and the Earth was just about this big, you know. And that's a long way off where everybody is, because you're glad to be there, but at the same time you want to go back home afterwards. And it's a long way there.
The sky, of course, was black, but it had sort of a velvet sheen to it because of the light maybe that was coming in our visor.
The biggest visual surprise was just how black the sky was. You have a brilliant sun, brighter than any sun you normally would see even here in New Mexico. You have these extraordinarily high mountains. We were in a valley deeper than the Grand Canyon. But then you have this black sky, a sky blacker than black, as the old Vidicon expression used to be. And it was hard to get used to. I never got used to it.
I've often tried to explain the difference between darkness, when you turn out the lights and it's dark in here, or blackness. Blackness is the endlessness of it all. It's hard to comprehend, but I can tell you the infinity of space and infinity of time, the endlessness of space and the endlessness of time, which we on this planet move through in our solar system with the rest of the stars and the planets in the universe, does truly exist. Infinity does truly exist. The endlessness does exist, because I saw it with my own eyes.
I think it surprised and shocked the people on planet Earth. They thought we were going to find rhyolite rocks, and all we found were norites and anorthosite rocks, which are totally different kind of rocks. Very old rocks at Descartes, 3.92 billion years old. Of course, Charlie and I are a bunch of fighter pilots, so they thought they hadn't trained us right in the rocks, and we'd picked up the wrong ones.
I kind of think they maybe thought that, well, we wasted 6 years of geology training on these two dunces. You know, they don't even know what they're looking at.
We'd had 25 field trips, so we'd seen a lot of rocks, and we knew what we were looking at, and they argued with us all the way back from the moon that the rocks we had were not what we really found. So I told them, you don't want to just wait till you get these back on the ground and take a look at them yourself. And they were arguing with us. A bunch of scientist guys, of course.
And a lot of this dust stuck to our boots and stuck to our suits, so when we got back inside, we tracked this stuff in with us. And some of the bags weren't sealed shut, and so you could feel, once you took off your helmet and your gloves, the lunar soils the regolith was so dry that it picked up all the oils in your fan and became like graphite. what it felt like to me. And when you smell that, it had a distinct odor of gunpowder.
And I don't remember when we first noticed it, but once you get into that, it's just all the time.
Bend over, John.
That surface is very dusty and permeates the cloth of your pressure suit.
As good as I can do. Okay, we copy that. Go.
Even though there were little pebbles and rock fragments all mixed into this, what's called the regolith, that you couldn't tell, but we'd been told that it probably went down 10, 15, 20, 30 feet before it would come to bedrock. There were even some notable people who thought that there might be places on the moon and we might choose one where things were so soft that we would get buried 50 feet deep in the dust. But we don't remember the name of that guy.
We wanted to discover ancient civilizations, or we wanted to see something that nobody had ever seen before. It didn't turn out to be that way.
Well, there were a lot of geological discoveries that you hoped you would have of some nature, but when they actually occurred, they were surprises.
Oh, hey! There is orange soil. It's all over. Orange.
It's really fantastic.
You could carry the equivalent of a 100-pound sack of moon rocks and jump up to the second rung of the lunar lander, which is that high off the floor here, and flat-footed. That 1/6 gravity is really nice. And when you drop your pencil in 0 gravity, you can chase it for 3 hours. When you drop it in 1/6 gravity, just look down and there it is.
The big surprise was this navigational problem and the undulations of where it obscured the landmarks, the near landmarks that we were looking for, and the inability to accurately judge distance like we thought we could. We weren't lost in any sense, but they wanted us to know our location very precisely, and we simply couldn't find it very precisely.
All of us needed to do more human things that people on Earth can connect with.
John was saying, well, Houston, we were going to do the Moon Olympic. So he starts to bounce and I started to bounce, and we sort of both bounced a little bit, sort of the high jump, and I got pretty up there pretty good. John's balance was excellent when he was doing it, and I got jumping. And when I did, I straightened up, and the backpack weighed as much as I did, and so center of gravity shifted backwards, and I just rotated around and was over on my back before I realized it. And that was a moment of panic, because that backpack is not designed for a impact onto the lunar surface, even in 1/6 gravity. But I was able to roll to my right and break my fall and bounced onto my back, but my heart was pounding. It really was.
Charlie, that ain't any fun, is it? Well, sorry about that.
Old Charlie wasn't too fearless at that moment.
Charlie fell down a couple of times.
I was thankful to be alive.
When we were ready to leave the moon, and Houston said,
Tranquility Base, Houston, you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway.
Of course, on our flight, Alan Shepard stole a moment right near the end and hit his golf shot, and I threw a javelin after his golf ball, so that was a slight moment of levity.
One of the things that was wonderful about Apollo, although I didn't know at the time, was when Al Shepard hit the golf ball. And I can remember being in mission control, seeing him hit this golf ball, and I said to myself, why is he wasting his time? Why isn't he picking up more rocks, you know? It took me a couple years to realize that, you know, that's a bad thought. Really, he should have done exactly what he did. We should have done something like that and picked up less rocks. We got plenty of rocks on Earth from the moon. Maybe not enough good stories. So I said, Pete, why didn't we think of that? And Pete said, well, we're not golfers. I said, well, if we'd thought of something like that, what would we have done? He says, well, we might have taken a football.
I had a picture of my family that I had carried to the moon with me, and I had done this because I wanted, my boys were young at the time, almost 5, and one was 7. I wanted to get them involved, so we decided we'd take a picture of our family in our backyard, and on the back of that picture, and I told the boys we'd take this to the moon, so y'all would be on the moon. I wrote, this is the family of astronaut Charlie Duke, who landed on the, from planet Earth, who landed on the moon on Apollo 16 on the 20th of April, 1972, and so we all signed that. And then I just put in a little piece of shrink wrap plastic and just dropped it on the moon and took a picture of the picture.
It's a very vivid set of images that I have of what we did on the moon, and I again feel very privileged to have recorded those images.
Us guys that got to go were just lucky. I thought being in the right place at the right time, and it was a lot of fun up there.
When it came time to leave and I started up the ladder and I looked at my boot prints down there, I wanted to stop the clock. In a simulator, when you train to go to the moon and you have a problem or you want to discuss them, you say freeze the simulator, stop time. That's what I wanted to do going up that ladder. I wanted to stop time and savor the moment. And I walked up or climbed up that ladder just as slowly as I could, knowing that I'd get to the top and I'd eventually have to crawl in that hatch and close the hatch, and that was going to be it. That's a moment that's a little bit deeply embedded in my heart and my memory than even the first step on the moon. It's the last steps that I took.
In quarantine on the carrier, when we were first shown the impact that this had on Walter Cronkite, it was clear that what it is we had participated in had a tremendous impact. And we had an interest in sharing the impact that had on a lot of people. But we missed it because we were not here to savor the success. And of all the people who were interested in the outcome of that, we were probably as much concerned in the outcome, the successful outcome, as anybody.
I think what it did was make me satisfied for the rest of my life with my life. I feel like I've had more than a life's worth of luck.
We were well liked and applauded and welcomed as heroes and all of those kind of things, and so that kept the emotion. And then right after that, we got put on the backup crew for Apollo 17. And now, man, I'm training again, you know, and if Jack Schmitt breaks his leg, here I go, you know, and so that was sort of the motivation. And then after Apollo was over and we started in December of 1972, probably right after that in January, so I had the thought, well, it's all over. Now what are you going to do with the rest of your life?
The question that bothered me, troubled me when I came back from the moon was, what does it feel like to walk on the moon? And I didn't know what it felt like to walk on the moon. I could tell you what I did and the things we performed, but I was not aware enough of inner feelings at that point to answer the question. And it was only after being pummeled with that question by people, and children particularly, that I decided I better find out what that answer was. And that led eventually to my opening up into this whole noetic sciences area, because awareness and perception is very fundamental here.
One of our first appearances when we got out of quarantine as a crew was to go to Milwaukee and receive the Pierre Marquette Discovery Medal from Marquette University. So as we were walking up the street, there were a lot of demonstrating students around, and they started throwing eggs at us because we represented the establishment and the success of the establishment in achieving something that evidently wasn't the kind of thing that they felt that they wanted to support. But it struck me as something that I certainly want to remember, that even in the glory of our first public appearance, that students threw eggs at us to give a sense that not everyone was so exuberant at what we'd been doing.
Every once in a while you would get a question from the audience that said, was it really worth it? Or did you really go? Or something like that. But I don't consider that a negative thing. That's more curiosity or maybe somebody trying to get their 15 minutes of fame. I don't know.
People will come up to me often and say, I've got a cousin that doesn't believe you ever landed on the moon. And they'll say, what do you say? And I'll say, well, I don't know what to say. I said, I believe we landed on the moon. I believe we did, but you don't know me, and you know your cousin really well. So you have to decide. I don't know.
Well, they got a TV program that says we didn't go. Yep.
My grandkids now, you know, their classes hardly touch on Apollo. You know, I go to schools to talk and say, well, which shuttle did you fly? You know, well, I didn't fly any shuttles. I was way before that. You know, and then they start looking at the rockets and the models and stuff that I take. I show them a little video, and then they get excited.
It's like when JFK challenged the American people to go to the moon back in 1961. He reached out into the 21st century. He reached out in today's world. He grabbed a decade at a time, picked it up, put it back in, opened the 60s and 70s, put it back in, called it Apollo. We went to the moon, we came home, and here we are in the 21st century starting all over. But the fact is, it did happen. And the fact is, it's a great asset for education. It's a great asset for kids to dream.
Everybody in astronaut corps knew I was leaving to be an artist. And so some of my friends that understood art came up and tried to, they said, you know, we're sorry to see you go, Al, whatever. And then they might say, do you think being an artist is really a worthy way to use the rest of your life? And I had expected this because I knew some people, particularly, you know, really right-brained people, they're not thinking art very much. And I told them, well, I didn't know, but I thought so. And when I first left NASA and talked about art, most people would just kind of fog over and then immediately go talk to someone else about something else.
Started working on a space shuttle, and that was an interesting challenge. We had to design, develop, and test and check that rascal out and flying it, and it just seemed like a natural thing to do, is to hang in there and get it done. Now I'm working as a consultant to headquarters on the architecture of going back to the moon and developing the crew exploration vehicle and how we need to do that.
I had spent part of the 2 years before getting to know more about the United States Senate, about people who work there, more about what it, in my spare time, what it took to run for office. And I felt like I was more or less prepared to go out and mount a campaign. I've taught at the University of Wisconsin on a part-time basis as an adjunct professor. In the last year, I've been using most of my time to try to put together the advisory structure, a new advisory structure for NASA.
And I had to figure, what am I going to do from here? Well, by that time, my family life had somewhat come apart. My mother committed suicide a little over a year before my flight to the moon, probably because she did not want to deal with, well, a contributing fact would be that she didn't want to have to deal with the notoriety that would come along with her son having gone to the moon. There were other unhappinesses in the domestic relationship that were involved in that. But anyway, there was a basic depressive tendency that exists throughout members of my family. I felt my problem was dealing with a mental depression. Well, it turned out that that really wasn't the problem. It was something that led to even more of an inherited tendency from both of my parents for the overuse of alcohol. When you've been to the moon and then you don't know what you ought to be doing after that, you're a very ripe candidate. And if you've inherited those tendencies at the same time, the chances are it's going to get a hold of you, which it did. So I've concentrated on how to make a better space program and how to take the creativity that I exhibited by coming up with new ways of doing rendezvous at MIT that was realistic enough to be the basis for what we ended up doing in the Gemini program, and then was adapted in Apollo, and still is the basis for how we do space rendezvous today.
Why do people explore in the first place? It's for the long-term preservation of the species, you know, whether in space or in medicine or whatever you're exploring in. The curiosity of human beings is to keep going. Just like those little fire ants in my backyard, they go around the front all the time. They're really explorers. Well, people are the same way.
I think we were modern-day explorers. And I think that's just a continuation of the nature of man to explore. Inner space, outer space, you know, medicines and technological achievement, and you know, I think we have this inquisitive nature that God's given us, and we're never satisfied with the status quo. Let's look out beyond.
The reason we took pilots like me to the New World is you had to have those skills to get to the New Worlds, to the moon and back, and you didn't have any extra room on the spaceship for a Columbus kind of guy. And so maybe if we had, we could have taken Arthur Clarke or a true explorer. And even though Neil is cast as an explorer, he really is a pilot, astronaut, flyer kind of guy that when he got there, then he did exploration. And that's okay too, because Lewis and Clark weren't explorers either. They went out and became explorers, and now we think of them. Columbus was.
If Columbus were here today, think of the questions you'd ask him. If you had Columbus here and Neil Armstrong here, what did it feel like? What did it feel like when you first stepped on the moon? Mr. Columbus, what did it feel like when you first stepped on in a new world? Mr. Columbus, were you scared? Neil, were you scared?
Columbus, Captain Cook, or some such individuals of the history who did their bit to explore the planet in the earlier days. And here we're starting to explore off the planet in our days.
No, I don't think we were so much modern-day Columbi, as we were maybe more like Lewis and Clark. We knew where we were going, more or less. We knew what it was going to take to be successful, more or less. We knew there were risks and there were unknowns. So I think the Apollo astronauts would be feel more at home sitting down around a table talking with Lewis and Clark than they would be talking with Columbus or Magellan. And also to be constrained by Newton. Namely, there was a certain amount of time we were going to be gone and we better be back. With Columbus and Magellan, they didn't know where they were going to come. When they were going to get back, they didn't have any constraint of a timeline.
I see myself a little bit like maybe a crewman on Columbus's ship. Columbus convinces them we need to go explore. And suddenly someone puts a notice on the board, do you want to try to go to India the other way by sailing west? And I say, yeah, I'd love to do that. Sounds like a lot of fun. I hope we don't fall off the end of the earth. So when they pick crew members, they pick me. And so I'm on the Nina, the Pinta, or the Santa Maria. and I'm doing my job. I'm first mate maybe, or maybe I'm pulling an oar or whatever they're doing.
I think Columbus and things that were pioneered by people maybe before the World War II time period were driven a good bit by the individual quest. The Wright brothers, Lindbergh, other people who were involved in pioneering things could do that with their own individual drive. They could gather in the support that was needed. I think that after World War II, the pioneering efforts required quite a bit more support in order to carry them out to such a striking degree.
If other people want to look at me as a modern-day Columbus, that's fine. But it puts a tremendous responsibility on my shoulders to share with them everything that I've experienced and at least take them back to that period of time in history vicariously.
What breaking the bonds of Earth and getting out into the gravitational field and get into free fall, essentially. The main thing that happens is you start to see it with different perspective. You start to see Earth as a finite place. And when you get high enough, you start to see the curvature. And then you start to see the whole disk of the Earth. And you start to see it in juxtaposition to the moon. And the stars start to become bright because you don't have the atmosphere to block the light rays. The best you can say for ordinary people who haven't done it is getting out of the trees and seeing the forest, or getting to the mountaintop experience where you can see the panoply and panorama of everything laid out below you. And it's a very heightened experience of wow and excitement and wonder as you look at this majesty that you've never seen before.
Whether there was some sense of spirituality change, other than the fact that before I went, I wanted to do things that were of significance in the actions that I would take, and if we were successful, how I might choose to give thanks. And by serving myself, communion was a way of doing that. But I talked to Deke Slayton about that ahead of time, and he said, no, you shouldn't do that, or he didn't want me to. So I said, well, I'll just talk about having people give thanks in their own particular way and won't make any reference.
Tranquility, you can go ahead. This is the LEM pilot. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask every person listening in, whoever, wherever they may be, to pause for a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours, and to give thanks in his or her own way. Over. Roger, Tranquility Base.
And he certainly was correct in doing that, and I realized it then, and certainly have considerably since then, because that's serving communion is a very sectarian thing and is something that's recognized by a limited population.
It was not a religious experience because religion is man-made. But was it a spiritual experience? Yes. The uniqueness and the ability of people to find a way with the technology at hand to get a human being like me out there to another planet. And I was looking back at the Earth, or I was looking back at the other stars in the universe. Science and technology could no longer explain to me what I was feeling. Not just what I was seeing, it's what I was feeling. And I kept thinking, above all religions, there must be a creator. It doesn't make any difference how you dress him or by what name you call him, but a creator that stands above all religions.
In my flight plan, I'd written down some points along the way so I wouldn't forget to sort of think about if I could feel any different spiritual differences or be open to anything that might occur. Now, when I did these things periodically during the flight, some on the moon, some en route to the moon, some around the moon, I never felt any different. wanted to feel different, but I never did. When I got back home and the Apollo program was over and I heard other astronauts talking, what I noticed was that nobody changed their spiritual beliefs. Someone that was very spiritual beforehand was maybe a little more spiritual now. Someone that was agnostic before, he was more agnostic. Someone that was atheist before, more atheist. So I felt like it just reinforced whatever you believed.
Coming back, I didn't see the wonders of the creation, if you will. It was, the psalmist says that the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the works of his hands. Now, I didn't see that then. Now I look back on my experience and I see that. I was probably more focused on the Big Bang and this, out of all this chaos has come the earth and us, and so to me, God was just somewhere out there, and I was more focused on how did it all come about, not under the guiding hand of God, if you will. But there was, I did believe there was a God. But if I had if there was really a God in my life, it was my career. You know, that was the first thing. The Bible says, seek first the kingdom of God, put God first, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind, all your soul. Put God first. Well, God wasn't first in my life. You know, I respected God, honored God on Sundays, but I mean, me and career was the most important part.
I became very deeply engaged in trying to understand an epiphany that I had on the flight, which was as I looked at Earth from space, and we were coming home, and could see the Earth, the moon, the sun, the stars in great profusion. I suddenly realized that the molecules of my body and the molecules of the spacecraft and my partner's bodies had been prototyped in an ancient generation of stars. At least that's standard cosmology for how matter is created through the stars. And instead of being an intellectual realization, it was a very deep personal experience with a, wow, what's this? And so I started digging into the nature of that, and I started a research foundation to study the nature of consciousness, because it was rather clear that that was the great mystery of, if we ask the question, who are we, how do we get here, and where's this all going, and what's it about? How do we fit in? It's because we're conscious. And the notion of consciousness has been the great enigma for centuries, except only now in the modern times did it appear we had the tools of science to perhaps address that question and the incentive to do it.
And I can imagine people saying to early pilots, you flew above the clouds. Did you see God up there? Or did you feel spiritually different? Now, that would be a logical thing to think about in the early days of aviation. Now we think it's strange because if there is a God, nobody knows, he's moved further out. And that's always been true of history. He used to be on top of Mount Olympus, if you remember. So when we got up there, well, he's a little bit further out.
And every time I look at the moon, I just wonder why we don't have a base up there that's permanently involved in exploring and industrializing that place, because it really is the key to our future.
When I look at the moon and think about it in that way, I'm generally with somebody in my family, or a loved one, or one of my children or grandchildren, and giving them a story about it. Otherwise, I look like I always have. Yeah, I was there. Okay, well, let's get on with it.
Yeah, we had a big moon the other night up in Kansas, and when I was up there, and I looked up, and it's I've been there. It's a great, a little sense of of pride and well-being wells up. You know, I said, man, that was exciting. And I can remember a lot of it. I mean, not every step, but almost every moment on the lunar surface. And, you know, and you just look up and, you know, man, we've been there. America put 12 men on the moon, and I was fortunate enough to be one of them.
Well, usually my wife comes to mind, because that's usually who I'm with, and it's awfully nice to have a chance to stare at a place you've been and wish that she could go there with you sometime. And she, by the way, wants to go there with me sometime. I don't know how we're going to arrange that. Time has moved a lot farther along than I thought it would before we're going to be back on the moon, but we'll be back there.
I can take you back there in a moment with a thought. I know where my daughter's initials are, I know where the rover is, I know where the tracks are, I know everything we did up there. It was a unique and special part of my life. When I look at the moon, I look at exactly where the Valley of Taurus Littrow is, where my Camelot is, and I just now took myself back there. I know what it looks like, I know what it feels like, I know what the 1/6 gravity is like. It's almost unreal for me to accept the fact that I've done it.
I look up there and I find the equator. And I'll look over about 30 degrees west. That's where we landed the Ocean of Storms. And then I'll look for the crater we landed near, the crater surveyor spacecraft was in. Can't see it even with a telescope, but I'll kind of look there. Now, when I became an astronaut, after a year of being selected and going through basic training at NASA, then they gave me a little silver pin that had a star on it and 3 rays, like a shooting star with an orbit around it. First thing I did after I got my balance was pull that little pin out, and I go over to next to the spacecraft, and I took it and threw it as far as I could towards Surveyor. So it's in that 600-foot crater somewhere. I think about that little pin being up there. That's going to be as shiny when somebody goes up there and picks it up someday as it was the day I threw it.
I don't think it changed anything in my thinking other than, in retrospect, to realize what humankind can do if they put their mind to it. The answer to the question, if you can go to the moon, why can't you, and then fill in the blank, is that you can, for the most part. If you have the right technology base to stand on, as we did for Apollo, you can do just about anything if young men and women are motivated to accomplish what that thing is.
Well, I tell you, there were a lot of other guys out there in my generation who were in Vietnam, my colleagues, my peers, who did a hell of a lot more for our country than I did at the time. They were getting their tails shot off for spending time in prison while I was getting my picture in the paper, and that's a debt that I have yet to repay to that segment of my generation.
I was able to work my way into some very interesting opportunities. We'll just see how history decides to look at memories, and I probably won't be around to see what that was, but I've done the best I could.
As a pioneer, but primarily as a good father and family man, as a person dedicated to expanding the frontiers of knowledge. And that's it.
Don't need to be remembered. I don't care. I have a lot of things to worry about, but being remembered is not one of them. No offense.
Seems strange to me sometimes that I can care as much about painting a good painting as I did about flying an airplane really well or making an entry in a spaceship. And I think maybe that's a nice thing for people, because whatever dreams any of us have, they're just as strong as the president's dream. They're just as wonderful as anybody else in the whole world. But we are charged with making our dreams come true. They're not. I'd like to be remembered as the guy that did his duty. I tried to do it in the Navy, tried to do it at NASA, and then when I left NASA, I'm trying to do it right now. I'm trying to preserve what I think is worthy of me to do.
As an astronaut that accomplished his mission, that did it with skill and focus and commitment, I gave my all to it, and I'm not too excited about having Charlie Duke, 10th man to walk on the moon, on my tombstone. It's more Apollo mission was a great accomplishment in my life, but my service to God through my faith is even a greater one. And Ecclesiastes, in the end, the important thing is to know God, to love God, and walk humbly before God. And I want to be remembered as a man who did that.
As a spaceman, not an aviator, the space futurist. Other people want to be known as businessmen or aviators by continuing to fly and looking at past achievements. I want to be remembered as having at least taken the risks of looking into the future.
I don't have any aspirations of being remembered as anything special. Just a guy who had an opportunity to do something he believed in. My favorite song explains my philosophy, and that's called The Impossible Dream, Man from La Mancha, Reach for the Unreachable Star. I want those to know that nothing is any longer impossible. You can leave that legacy to people. And you know, if I want to get focused very close to home on my grandkids, I want every one of my grandkids to know that their papi it did not just what he wanted to do and didn't go out to the moon to be a hero and all that, but he did it because there was an opportunity.
If you got a song in your heart, and who knows how it got there, you better sing it, because when you're gone, nobody's there to sing it. And you'll be sad about it when you're laying on your deathbed saying, you know, I should have done that.
We had the privilege and the honor of carrying the hopes, the aspirations, the hard work of 450,000 Americans.
So one of the major significance is that we did this, and we had the plaque that said, "We came in peace for all mankind." And hopefully the world will continue to recognize that that was one of the major features embodied in the whole effort that we put forth.
The emotion was the excitement and the wonder of it all.
It was to me like I was just sitting in a rocking chair on a Friday evening, looking back home, sitting on God's front porch, looking back at the earth, looking back home. And it was really that simple, but it was an overpowering experience.
As a kid, I wanted to be an airplane pilot. And I saw the movies, and I saw Earl Flynn or John Wayne or somebody like that flying airplanes, and I thought, boy, this looks like a lot of fun. Never thought of going into space, never imagined that that would happen.
I became a pilot when I was 13. I washed airplanes to earn flying time when I was still a teenager. But I also was interested in engineering and science.
So it sort of narrowed down eventually that I would want to go to one of the academies, and my father preferred the Naval Academy, but I decided, since I had gotten seasick as a youngster at summer camp, that maybe going to West Point would be a better thing to do.
And I knew very early in my life I wanted to fly. I wanted to fly airplanes. I wanted to go one step further. I wanted to fly airplanes off of aircraft carriers, because I guess that even challenged me more as a third or fourth or fifth grader.
I was going to be an aeronautical engineer and build airplanes, and I built them all the way through high school.
Well, the first thing I can remember as an aspiration was to be a forest ranger. I thought for some reason it would be neat to be out in a lookout tower looking for forest fires. That's the first sort of career idea that I can remember having. I don't know how old I was.
I fell in love with airplanes while I was at the Naval Academy. I had this young desire, but then I sort of transferred it to the Navy, but then I realized at the Naval Academy I could go fly airplanes. And so I made the decision my senior year to go volunteer for the Air Force.
All of us came to NASA because we were good at flying high-performance airplanes. We were good at doing the things in the best airplanes that there were, okay? And suddenly the space program shows up, so now we get a chance to do those things in a spaceship, which is even more complicated and even more difficult, even more dangerous. So that appealed to all of us.
And it wasn't until I'd been in the service as a naval officer and pilot, about to complete my service, when Sputnik went up. I was quite sure that humans would be right behind robot spacecraft. So going into space suddenly became the objective. But that wasn't until 1957.
Well, when President Kennedy said he wanted to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth within a decade, and I was a test pilot at Patuxent River, and returning safely to Earth sounded like a great idea to me. So I told all my buddies they ought to put in for it. They were looking for test pilots, and so we all put in for it.
But I never really started to think about space until I was in Norway as a Fulbright student in 1957, and experienced, like so many people of my generation, the launching of the first artificial satellite of the Earth, Sputnik 1, and saw its impact on the international student community that was there with me at the time. And so that sort of triggered at least me thinking about space as something important that was going on.
So I was off being a test pilot. I was accepted and went through test pilot school and was doing that, and just thought I had the greatest job in the world. And one day I turned on the TV, and there was Al Shepard on top of a rocket, and he went off, and just in 15 minutes he'd gone higher than I'd ever gone and faster than I'd ever gone, and more importantly, made more noise doing it. I said, you know, maybe he's got the best job in the world.
And so I volunteered for test pilot school, where I could use my education and satisfy my love for flying. I think it was September of 1965, NASA announced that they were going to have another group of astronauts that would be picked and hopefully trained for this Apollo program. And so I volunteered because it was the best job you could have as a test pilot back in those days.
I just happened to be in the pipeline where astronauts came from, because we needed people to fly spaceships, and the closest thing to flying spaceships on Earth is flying high-performance airplanes. And so I began to see how to become an astronaut, and it turns out that I was accidentally in the pipeline. So I applied to be an astronaut, and with my background and through the selection programs, they took me.
Well, when NASA and the National Academy of Sciences decided jointly that they would ask for volunteers from the science and engineering community to become astronauts. I thought about 10 seconds and said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
I was assigned over to Korea flying F-86s. I did have 2 opportunities to shoot down 2 MiG-15s, which I did during the 66 combat missions that I flew. With about 8 years service as a fighter pilot, I decided I'd go to MIT for a master's program. I'd chosen my thesis subject, which was rendezvous in space. I understood how to intercept airplanes in the atmosphere, but everyone was going to have to be able to join up spacecraft, so it was perhaps one of the wisest decisions I made in 1961, really, before it was even decided for sure that lunar orbit rendezvous would be the method of our getting to the moon.
I was chosen because I had impeccable credentials, a good record. I was the only astronaut at that point in history that had both test pilot credentials and a PhD from an engineering school. So I had been adding credentials until they couldn't ignore me any longer.
So in October of 1963, I got a phone call from Deke Slayton asking me if I wanted to join the astronaut program. And of course I said I would, and we started training in January of 1964.
The selection process is still a big mystery to me. We didn't have a big chart with fill these X's and do these squares and check off these procedures and you're going to get a flight.
Don't have a clue. There were some really good people that didn't get selected, and I was just lucky to be one of the people that did. And I feel lucky enough to have been at the right place at the right time and doing the kind of things that I'm able to do. I'm able to learn systems and how they operate and how they don't operate, and participate in spacecraft test and development and check out for human beings.
But there was no guarantee you were going to fly in Apollo, but you would be working on Apollo. So that's where everybody's focus was. We had engineering duties, if you will, sort of oversight of certain systems of the spacecraft and the launch vehicle. I was assigned to work for Frank Borman on the Saturn V launch vehicle.
And then they suddenly decided to put me over in Skylab. And Skylab was the next program after Apollo. Well, I didn't want to be there. Nobody wanted to be there. But there I was, and once again I had the choice. Am I going to go pout because I'm not in Apollo where I really want to be? And my
Buck Rogers.
Buck Rogers.
Buck Rogers.
No such thing as space travel.
No such word as astronaut.
Couldn't even spell astronaut, probably.
I don't even remember anybody dreaming of that.
In those days, you read Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers.
Buck Rogers going through the universe on a rocket ship somewhere. That was truly fantasy.
The ship's at least 100 years ahead of anything I ever saw. I wonder how fast we're going. About 1,000 miles an hour at least.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Born from a generation nurtured by space heroes, these men turned science fiction fantasy into reality. It became man's supreme effort. 12 extraordinary men were the first humans to walk on another world, spearheading the greatest adventure in history. They gave us all hope at a time when the heart of our nation was in anguish and turmoil. They made the world pause. Have you ever walked on a cloudless night with a view of the heavens and wondered what it must have been like to walk on that airless moon? What kind of person would be willing to risk their life to leave Mother Earth? Why was anyone willing to leave our world for the first time in history? Have you ever wondered who these men are and what they accomplished? These are the men who allowed themselves to be lifted off the earth by the inspired work of 450,000 people. And yet these chosen few, each hurtling into history, we hardly know.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down.
I'm going to vote for Barry Goldwater, and I urge you to do the same.
1965.
United States aircraft have resumed action in North Vietnam.
Demonstrators must depart from the Pentagon grounds by midnight.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot outside a Memphis motel this afternoon.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible?
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
You got to put his challenge to go to the moon in a proper context of time. The Russians owned space at that point in time. Sputnik had long since been launched. Yuri Gagarin went up the previous month, the first human being ever to get into space, and he orbited the Earth once, came back. And Alan Shepard finally went up 16 minutes and came down. He didn't even get in orbit. This country was decimated with campus unrest, civil strife, the beginnings of what became a very, very unpopular war. We desperately needed a hero. And Alan Shepard, back in May of 1961, was our hero. 3 weeks later, the President of the United States says, okay, now we're going to go to the moon. I guess we know enough about space. We didn't know tiddlywinks about going into space. And he not only challenged us to go to the moon, he challenged us to do what most people thought was impossible. He challenged us to get to the moon before the end of the decade. And what he didn't say, but what he really meant was we're going to get there before the other guy does, before the Soviets did at that point in time. And that challenge, you know, the gauntlet was picked up by the American people. You know, all 7 people got involved, and they didn't know they couldn't do it.
Look, another one of those spaceships.